So welcome. My name's Roger Berkowitz, and we're going to spend the next hour talking about the language of race. I have with me two amazing people to lead us on this discussion. John McWhorter, who is a linguist, studied many languages. It's been interesting spending the last day with him and hearing him in conversation break into at least 5 or 6 different languages that I've heard over the time, some of which I've never heard of before, so that's been exciting. He's the author of many books on language and race, The Power of Babel and Woke Racism, most recently, one of his many bestsellers. And it's nice to have him here. He used to be a columnist for The Atlantic and now is a weekly column for the New York Times. And then Ayishat Akanbi, who's a fashion stylist, writer, and cultural commentator, who has brought incredible honesty and thoughtfulness to a whole host of political and artistic understandings of style in the last few years, and really a new voice that's been exciting to bring into this conversation. So welcome, Ayisha. And she was here last year, so welcome back. I wanted to start by asking John, who is a linguist, and since we're in a conversation about language here at the Alpine Fellowship, how did you become a linguist? What were the issues or questions that drove you to study language as a profession and a career?
Well, linguistics is a strange thing in that what we actually do is rather different than what one might think one is doing from the outside. We tend to be more interested in how people say things rather than what they say, although there's a fine line between the two. And what interested me about languages first was just being, a boring American English speaker who heard other languages at a young age rather suddenly because I had an extremely Anglophone upbringing, and just hearing Hebrew. It's the first other language I ever heard. I was just stunned that I couldn't understand what the girl was saying. And I had no idea there were other languages, very American. And I now know that for most people, it just wouldn't have mattered. They would have just thought, I don't know what she's saying, what's for dinner? For me, it was, I want to be able to do that. And to be honest, it wasn't because of culture. I didn't know what Jewish meant. It wasn't, I want to be like her. It was, how does she know that code and I can't do it? It literally brought me to tears. I was 5. And then you just move on, and I was interested in learning other codes because I thought that was an interesting thing to do, and I'm kind of obsessive. And so to fast forward into my 20s, I felt like the only job I would be good at is being a college professor. And then the question was, what would I do? What would the subject be? And I thought by default, it must be this thing called linguistics. And so there are about 9 ways of being a linguist. The ones that I really do for my academic career are about how languages change over time and why. And then also what happens when languages come together and become new languages, and what is that process like? Because it's not chaos, it's not a problem, it's actually the way most languages have come into being. And so it's a fun career. If you turn outward towards the public, then the public understandably is more interested in language and social questions. Or if you turn into other disciplines, people are more interested in what's called the philosophy of language. And so one learns as a linguist to speak those languages as well. But for me, it just starts with being a language nerd, like all these languages that you've apparently heard me break into. I wasn't aware I was doing it, but I was just having a very bad conversation with the women who change our beds and things. I was trying to see how far I could get. And we managed to communicate. I was saying the bed is very short, please leave it looser at the bottom. That's about all the Italian I speak. But yes, that's the heart of me. But it's a much larger subject than that.
Right. One of the things you've written about is what is a language, and you wrote early on a fair bit about Black English. Some people call it Ebonics or other words. So I'll just ask you, what is a language and what is Black English? And then and I know Ayisha has some ideas on this too, and we'll start talking about that a bit.
Well, one thing I should insert for the purposes of this general conference is that a language is something that is designed for communication. Especially people like us think that language must also be for reflection, and you think that you can't think without words. That piggybacks on what language began as being for. Why language was subject to natural selection was because it allowed people to communicate in order to join in on efforts to survive. Solitary reflection is artificial. I would actually venture to say that dwelling on solitude and cherishing solitude is not natural to humans. Actually, this is scientific research. 2 people I've asked, this is science. Two anthropologists I asked who have worked with very small groups. I said, is there anybody among the 150 who prefers to be alone up on a mountain and is given to ennui and depression? And they said, no, that doesn't exist in a group like this because everybody has a sense of purpose and communication happens all day long, all the time. You don't sit alone and read, you don't sit alone and reflect. So what a language is for is this, not for this. But any human being who is using language as a complex and nuanced system is using language. Now, what you call it, whether you think of it as quote unquote a real language because it's used in writing or not, all of that is artificially imposed upon all of us and we can't escape it. But that means that the way, for example, most black people in the United States speak, it's called African American Vernacular English. I've never liked that title. It kind of sounds like a disease, but it's now so set that I have to say AV. I still call it Black English. But it is as much language as the language of the Wall Street Journal or the Times of London. If a Martian came down, they would have as much to tackle in learning Black English. And not just the slang, but the grammatical patterns as they would if they landed in Connecticut or if they landed somewhere in London. And so that's what Black English is. When I first started doing linguistics, I avoided Black English because it wasn't away from, it was too close to home. My thought was I didn't get into linguistics to study the way my relatives speak. But people want to know about it. I did grow up in it, and so I've started to do my share. That is my favorite kind of dog in the world. That Vizsla, I adore Vizslas. If I didn't have 2 kids, I would buy a Vizsla. In any case, the idea is that Black English is something that in the United States is thought of as garbage talk. And so I've taken it on as a responsibility to write a couple of books about that and to do columns. So that's what Black English is.
Ayisha, do you want to, what is your, I mean, you're not from the US. Is Black English something you've addressed or thought about, or in what ways have you?
Not necessarily, but there certainly is when it's funny because I think I got into these conversations where I'm in spaces like this through recognizing a big shift in language in the way I guess a lot of Black people in particular were talking about race and how they were talking about themselves and describing themselves with words that I hadn't, that weren't so common before. It wasn't so common that I heard words like white supremacy and things like that. So that was part of what got me interested in it. But I'd say now, I haven't given, I would say, as much thought to Black English, but one thing I definitely recognize at the moment is something that I'm thinking about, and we spoke about briefly last night, is a lot of internet speak. A lot of the slang that gets popularized on the internet comes from a lot of Black queer culture, so an example may be like, Yas Queen, that's something that lots of people say on the internet, or even living my best life. I really have the sense that that probably comes from some type of queer kind of culture. Yeah, but I think it does. It very much tracks with, how a lot of drag queens and people within that environment kind of speak. And I see this as generally quite a positive thing that, we're in a space now where, people who have not grown up in that community, people who never even ventured into it, are adopting and borrowing some of our popular ways of speaking. But that's not always that's not always welcomed, and I question why that's not always welcomed when essentially we're trying to move away from what some people would term white supremacy. And so to incorporate other language from other cultures seems to be a way to, I think as you were saying, like to stop kind of prioritizing one type of speaking as the best way of speaking. So that sort of interests me, that why so many people are resistant to, Black American speech becoming more widespread.
Yeah, I mean, John, you were talking about this that there's a feeling that many, I think, people in the culture have, and maybe black people in culture have, that whites using black language is a kind of appropriation. How does that come about? Is that I assume that's not a linguistic problem, that's a cultural problem, but how do you think about that?
Well, I don't know if it's a problem. What's come to be called cultural appropriation is just cultures exchanging from one another. And there's kind of a 1.0 answer. In America, there's a whole conversation that white people shouldn't use black English forms, slang, or grammar because that's taking away something that belongs to black people, and that parallels Elvis Presley doing a musical form that Chuck Berry and Little Richard couldn't make as much money from. And I think that the analogy is kind of strained. And the answer isn't just, well, people have always exchanged cultures. The answer isn't that tomatoes were not originally Italian. The idea is 2.0, that you're not supposed to culturally appropriate from people who have less power than you. But the problem is that that also has always happened. And to try to put a pox on it will just mean that it'll keep happening, and yet it becomes a source of what I think of as a performative kind of upset. When you start pushing 60, you are in the position of remembering another time when you were an adult. So you aren't a kid, it's in full color, but you remember another time, and not a time that's so distant that it's irrelevant. So you're not talking about the 1890s. But growing up in the 70s and 80s, I now know that there are people 40 and under who don't remember when white people didn't use black English forms in that way because black people were thought of as a balkanized other and inferior. The fact that it's happening so much now is an indication that the walls are coming down. Not that they're fully down, but that they're coming down. And I think of it as a matter of celebration. But those are fighting words in some circles in the United States. And I worry because we have so many things to worry about in this world. Whether or not, a white person says, living my best life, I think that should be rather low on the totem pole of concerns. And yet here we are.
So why don't we put a point on it and say, if there's one, and there's a couple words that are under debate here, ratchet, bro, things like that. But the word that I think has captivated many people around the world is the N-word. What do you guys think about the N-word and its use?
You want it or me?
I know. Yeah, the N.
The word we won't speak.
Yes, the word that shall not be named. Well, I've always felt like I've had a minority position on the N-word, in that I don't like the use in popular music. I've always thought that I've never bought this idea that we've reclaimed it. I think a reclaiming of the word can't still sting you in that way when other people use it. So for instance, many people have reclaimed the word queer. And so there are still some people, generally older people, maybe above 50, who see queer as a slur. But for the most part, if you're straight and you refer to someone, a gay person, as queer, they're not going to be offended because they've successfully reclaimed the word. But there is no successful reclamation of the word at all. And so I feel that it's naive. I feel it's naive to expect people listening to music where it's every other word, it's like grammar, to expect them to not, at least while, singing the music, to not sing along to that. I think a lot of the offense that actually people take to the word when other people say it in context. So I'm not talking about people actually trying to use it as a slur, but when people are talking it in context because they're reading a passage that has the N-word in it, or they're singing music, I see that as quite performative. I don't see that as quite real. I think it comes down to the fact of we don't, some people very much feel like, as a group, as black people as a group, we don't have very much power. You guys have the power, you have the success, you have the privilege. This is our thing. This is our thing. So even if it makes no sense, even if no one else puts racial slurs in their music, for popular culture, even if no one else does it, we're going to do it. And our way of kind of showing you that we have something you can't have, type of thing. You know, you've taken everything else from us. Let us have this one thing. I think that is more the offense. Not even the offense. I think that's generally people's problem. I don't think it's a genuine sense of being offended by the word. We hear it way too much. We hear it way too much in music and in popular culture in so many different ways to genuinely feel, I personally think, a sting from it.
Is there a legitimacy to the performativity of offense? I mean,
Not for me personally.
performance is part of life.
Yeah, true.
So I'm wondering, I agree with you, it's performative.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what that means. What's the next step? Is performative always bad? Or is there something meaningful to performativity?
There might be, but in this context, I don't think there is. I don't think there is. I think about, you know, I've been around Pakistani communities, and sometimes, so in the UK, calling someone a Paki is a slur. I know, you know, in America that might not be the case. I'm not sure if that word, that slur is very popular there. But calling someone a Paki is a slur. And I've been around Pakistani people who refer to themselves in that way, but they would never put it in their music. Or I've even been around fat people, for instance. You might say to someone else, hey, what up, fatty? But they would never, you know, in their music put that in because they don't want to legitimize other people thinking that's an acceptable way to speak about them. So no, I think it's very confusing. I think, you know, our sort of defense and protection around this word, I think if we were to actually reclaim it, we would have actually used it against racists. I think calling racists the N-word would have probably been a much better move than actually, you know, applying it to yourself, especially when it still hurts or you act as though it hurts you so much. So no, I don't personally see any sort of legitimacy to the performance, although, again, I imagine I would be heavily disagreed with by the people who use it.
Right. John, what's your? I know you've thought a lot about this. What are your thoughts on the N-word? A word you told me last night that you won't even say here in public.
Yeah, I don't know how much I've thought about it, but I've experienced the change in its usage in the United States and talking about remembering other eras. In the 90s, when I first started doing media interviews, it was accepted that if you were referring to the word, you could use it. I have on a cassette tape my very first interview in 1995, and it's me and a white person and a white host, and we use it. We don't say it over and over, but the thought was if it's a subject, then you can say it. And then things started changing right around that time for various reasons. There was something about the O.J. Simpson trial and a couple of speeches that were made. And by 2005, the idea was that even in reference, even if you were defending black people in some way, even if your head was in the right place, you weren't supposed to use the word if you weren't black. And I remember back then in the occasional class saying, by the way, class, I am going to use the word, and the reason is openly that I'm black myself, and I'm sure you understand. And I would just say, and it wouldn't be to call someone something, it would be if we were reading something or if we were talking about the word, I would just say it. About 5 years ago, I realized the climate was such that even I couldn't get away with that it had become a taboo word, a kind of a magic word. And I think, quite simply, that to not even be able to use it in reference is, it's nonsensical. I understand where the gesture comes from, but it's performative, and the simple fact is that if you say that you're strong, if you say that you're a strong black person, it simply doesn't cohere to also say if you utter one word, even in reference, even if you use the word for stingy niggardly, which happens to sound like it, if that's used, I'm going to fall to pieces. That's a performance. I don't think it's sincerely felt. However, it's not coming from some sort of malevolence. It's coming from the fact that there's so many ways to get a sense of group membership. There's so many ways of feeling a sense of purpose. If you're a black American, one of many ways to do that is to join this sense of there being this eternal battle against racism. There is real racism, but it's not that word that now I can't even say. Whereas I, the same person, wearing the same clothes with the same DNA, 10 years, well, I've bought a lot of new clothes since then, but 10 years ago, could say it in a public space and nobody would even flinch as long as it was within reason. So yeah, I find it a performance, and what worries me is that the idea that there's this word that can make any black person go to bed crying and calling their friends, it's a sign of weakness. And I'm not proud of weakness. I have a hard time identifying with it. Many black Americans, including one smarter than me, would disagree, but I would disagree back.
Yeah,
That's
funny
my
enough,
feeling.
it's got to a point as well where I've seen a lot of conversation online where black Americans don't even like anyone outside of America. So, black British people, Jamaicans, anything like that, using the N-word or even black to describe themselves. That's been a recent development. So I have a friend who was recently, a black friend who was recently in America. She's originally Ghanaian, but she was born in Britain. And, she referred to herself as black, or it came up somehow in conversation. And this African-American friend of hers was like, "You're not black."
Is that, what's the idea there?
So
the idea is that
is,
black is an American
yes,
invention.
Right. And so,
We're the real black.
Right. Go ahead.
Because we're descendants of slaves.
Right.
And so that's something, that's black, that's real, that's separate from Ayisha, that's separate from, frankly, the black people who we were. And the idea is that other black people are not supposed to horn in on our racket and are not supposed to seek the resources that are earmarked for black Americans in the United States. And there need to be some, but there's a territoriality there.
I mean, that's also come up with the idea of reparations or other things. I mean, there are black people who are descendants of slaves, and then there are black immigrants who've come from Ghana or Nigeria or elsewhere, and there's the question of, are they the same black people?
They're not, supposedly, they are not supposed to get reparations because they're not descendants of slaves, even if they suffer the same racist discrimination that native-born black Americans do. It's the, American Descendants of Slaves, ADOS, that's the new group. And so it means that I get reparations, but Ayishat, if you lived in Detroit, you don't get any. I'm not sure that makes sense, but
Right.
we're just stuck with it.
So this brings up, you guys have now both broached the question of racism and the way language relates to racism. Let's do a little linguistic work. What are some definitions and what are some distinctions? So let's start with racism. What's racism? What's systematic racism? What's prejudice? What's white supremacy? There's 4 words that we're going to try and talk about today.
John, you might take the lead on this one. I think.
Start where you want, but let's see if we can bring some clarity to these 4 words that are often meshed together as one, but I think need to be disaggregated in some way.
You put them in the right order. Again, there's this theme of becoming elderly and remembering another time. The original word, when I was coming up in the 70s, was prejudice. You're prejudiced. I didn't hear anybody say you're racist. I now know that people were using it in writing, but what was on TV, what was in conversation, my mother was very conscious of these sorts of things. She taught a course. She was a social work teacher. And the word was prejudiced, although now I'm realizing that the course she taught, starting from 1972 in Temple University's School of Social Work, was called Racism 101, not Prejudice 101. So that shows that the word was coming in at that time. To an extent, racist replaced prejudice, which is now, frankly, at least in the United States, archaic. It reminds me of, to make a reference that isn't going to work here, Archie Bunker. What was it called in Britain? Till Death Do Us Part, if anybody remembers that sitcom. In any case, racist, though, took on a larger significance. Nobody ever talked about societal prejudice, but the idea was that racism isn't only calling somebody the N-word, but it's also inequities baked into institutions. And so there's racism of name calling and cross burning, and then there's racism as in what is more likely to happen to you if you are born black. So that's what structural racism is. All terms lose their potency and have to be replaced. It's called the euphemism treadmill, and it's why races have different names. It's why there used to be something called home relief, which then became called welfare and now is called aid to dependent children. That's just the way it goes. Prejudice was replaced with racism partly because prejudice weakened in its force. Structural racism weakened in its force, and so it was actually one person, I think, who was responsible for this. White supremacy used to mean the Ku Klux Klan. It started being used for structural racism in about 2013, and I think Ta-Nehisi Coates, the writer at The Atlantic, was responsible. He started using it because structural racism got old. So now we call it white supremacy, which is a recruiting of a term that used to be for something that is much more severe and stark, but also rarer. And so terms change, basically.
Yes.
Yes.
So, if you look out at the world today, there are certainly issues around race in the world. What's the word that each of you would use to describe the problems we're facing? Is it white supremacy? Is it prejudice? Is it racism? Is it discrimination? Is it systematic racism? If you were to say, this is how we should talk about the problem of black people and white people in America or in the world today, how would you describe it?
Well, I think it depends on what the situation is. And so if it's, because generally we use racism to describe, prejudice, which could be different, or bias, which could be different. And so I think it's about trying to get clear on what we mean. And so if racism is institutional, is structural, then I don't think it's appropriate, let's say, in a conversation where someone might have asked you where you're really from. This is maybe more relevant in the European context. So it's quite often that, someone might be interested or curious about where you're from based on your name or this color of your skin. So quite clearly, you have a different lineage. And some people would perceive that to be racist. That's not helpful to me. I think that, I don't even necessarily think it's even prejudice. However, a lot of what we're talking about, I think most of the time, is in-group bias a lot of the time. I think a lot of it is. I don't necessarily think that, at least when I look at the UK context, I don't feel as though the issue is as structural. For me, it's actually, it's actually about the way we think of ourselves. It's not even, I don't know, it's less political for me, if I'm honest. It's the way that we've come to conceive of our identity. It's the way that we've come to think of what we now describe as blackness and what that means in the world. That to me seems to be more of an issue.
Ayishat, this is a genuine question. Is there a case, as there is in the United States, that the system in Britain is biased against people of color? Is it talked about that way?
Yes, it is talked about that way, but it's partly talked about that way because we have downloaded the American way of talking about race. Yes, quite literally. So your question again is, tell me again.
Is there structural racism in Britain in the way that there is in the United States against the brown as opposed to the white? And I don't know the data, I don't really know the history, so I'm just wondering, are there people saying that that is the issue?
Yes,
okay.
there are people saying that's the issue. Everything that they're saying is the issue in America is what they're saying is the issue in Britain.
Same thing?
Yes, exactly the same thing. Nothing has changed. And so yes, most conversations that are happening in Britain about race, you would think you're in America. There is absolutely no difference.
What would be an example of structural racism in Britain? And I'll ask John for one in America or two in America as well.
So there was a race report that came out, I believe, in 2021 in Britain. So it was actually investigating structural racism because we've been talking about it, as you said, probably since around 2013. For me, I think I started noticing conversations around race changing with Trayvon Martin. And so there was this race report that came out to investigate institutional racism, to see, how prevalent it actually was. And so they actually found that black boys, in particular in schools, were suspended at higher levels and expelled and excluded at higher levels. But it was actually not just, we were saying the word black, but actually it was Caribbean boys that were suspended at higher levels and things like that. And so for some people, I personally didn't see that is because a teacher wouldn't necessarily know who is African and who is Caribbean, not always. But for some people, the fact that Caribbean boys were being excluded was an example of systemic racism or institutional racism. What else would be an example?
So, John, if I understand your position on this, and again, it may have changed or not, you've said that outcomes, so the fact that more Caribbean boys have been expelled, is not your understanding of systemic racism. You don't think that's what racism is. But that you said that attitudes, that if there's an systematic attitude, you think that is, which in my thinking would bleed into prejudice. because it's not ideological and it's not legal or violent. So I'm just wondering how you think of and understand systematic racism in the United States.
Well, you have to be careful where you identify it. And so what people mean by that term is, for example, if you are black in the United States, you are less likely to grow up in a neighborhood where the public school is an excellent one and or there is affordable private school. So certain inequities can be persisted. There is no active verb persisted, perpetuated because of inequities like that. And so people would call that racism. I don't use the term structural racism because I think, and linguists are supposed to be descriptive rather than prescriptive, but the term racism has been stretched so far that you have to spend as much time teaching people what it means as in battling the actual phenomenon. I call it race-based inequities, and for the Times I have told them, don't change my words into societal racism anymore, it's not constructive. That's just me. There is structural racism, but it implies that the structure is a bigot. That's what most people think, and then you have to cut away those weeds. But a lot of what is called structural racism, frankly, just isn't, or it's more complicated. And so, for example, in the United States, in any city, black boys, and there is no divide in terms of region, it's just black boys are suspended at vastly higher rates than anybody else. And there are many people who have virtually made careers arguing that that's because of bias, and that's a possible hypothesis. If you actually look into the data in any of those cities, what you find is very simply what I think most people already suspect: black boys commit more violent acts in school. Then that's the simple truth. The question is why, and it's not because they're monsters, it's not because there's something wrong with being black, it's because they're more likely to be poor, and they're more likely not to have fathers in the home. Now, why is that? That's because of racist things in the past, especially in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and that's not fair, and how do you deal with it? But to say that it's due to racism in terms of bias now simply isn't fair to the teachers, and it turns a blind eye to the realities of violence in mostly black schools where the people who suffer from it are other black kids. So that's where the controversy comes in. So I think there is less of what's called structural racism than is often said, but it is there. There are biases that need to be fought and need to be talked about. But I think with clearer language, and I think also without a kind of hammer and nail approach to things.
Well, yeah, people definitely perceive a difference between, like I said, or like John said, actually, it's quite territorial. Our relationship to the N-word is we're very territorial about it. So for some people, you get a pass. If you're Latin American or if you're white and what, black Americans might call down, you might be able to get a pass if you're not doing the ER, So yeah, some people make a distinction with that. Again, I think it's all confusing, and yeah, I don't think it's very helpful, but there are some black people who will not be as offended, maybe if you've got some connection to that community, if you're not using the ER, if you're, a rapper or something like that. Lots of rappers who are not black, who come from the Hispanic community have often used the N-word. I'm sure J-Lo has, and that has never been picked up or anything like that. Often you get a lot of people saying, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. And people have an issue with that. That's almost as explosive as saying the N-word itself. When white people say to someone black, I don't see color. And I think again, that's another kind of performative way of interpreting the word, or the phrase. I think what people generally saying are, of course I can see your color, I recognize it. What they are saying is, I endeavor not to treat you differently as a result of it. That's all that means. So again, I personally think we should be working towards a colorblind society where we are doing that, where we are recognizing that, of course, if someone, we can sometimes tell if someone is gay. We recognize that they might have experienced things that we might not have. Homophobia, namely, but that does not mean that we have to treat them as gay people and kind of root their whole kind of existence in the fact that they've maybe experienced homophobia. So I think we should be moving towards a colorblind society. But again, that's even in the UK, that's a very controversial conversation. They think that's completely reductive. What people often seem to want is that, no, see everything that I've been through, see my oppression. If you don't see my oppression, you can't possibly understand me. Because as John was saying, I think it's becoming increasingly harder for people to see themselves outside of that.
Just wondering on the idea of persons or people of color. I don't know how many of you have seen the controversy around James Carville that happened last week around this. He was saying that the Democrats have to stop using things like Latinx and people of color because the people don't like these terms and don't use them. He said, I live in New Orleans. I don't go up to my black friends sitting on the corner and say, how you people of color doing? And he said, we just have to stop using these terms. I'm wondering where you guys stand on that.
I don't know. I don't like people of color. I don't use it myself. It just, again, it's not, we have an issue with the word colored, and it's just, in essence, the same thing. So again, I don't get that. I just try to avoid all of that, if I'm honest. I avoid it. I don't see, I don't have much on that.
I don't know what it means.
Yeah.
I have no idea what POC means. It used to be a sophisticated college town way of saying black person and Latinos too, and one or two Native Americans. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, but now it means something else. We have a huge South Asian population in the United States, a Southeast Asian population. Are Asians people of color?
Apparently.
There weren't, right, and there weren't as many Asians around until the 1980s in terms of ones who had grown up after the Immigration Act of 1965. I don't know what it means, and a lot of people who are colored don't particularly like being called a POC or that misleading term BIPOC. It's never going to catch on beyond college town, and so I figure there are bigger fish to fry. But I don't know what a person of color is, and maybe that's we've got progress at this point. My daughter's mother is white. I'm not. You can imagine what they look like, and it's about 2024. Are they people of color? I think they are human beings, and we'll see what they identify as, but I just don't know what it means. And if that sounds a little dismissive, it is.
We have to stop here, and I am sorry, but there's lunch or coffee break.
Thank you for John and Ayisha.